She thought she owned the room, but she had no idea who was about to sit in that chair. The air in the courtroom smelled like polished oak and stale paper, that dry, almost metallic scent that clings to places where decisions get written into people's lives. And I remember the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixing with the soft shuffle of shoes across tile as we waited. My name is Nathan Carter, and that morning I was just another husband sitting beside his wife, dressed in a simple gray suit that still held the faint scent of detergent from the night before. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, and that was exactly how Emily wanted it. She sat next to me, calm, composed, her hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes steady on the front of the room where the judge's chair stood empty, draped in a dark cloth like it was waiting for something important to happen. What most people didn't notice was how the bailiff glanced at her. Not long, just enough to register recognition, and then quickly looked away like he'd said too much without speaking. Across from us stood Vanessa Cole, HOA president, the kind of woman who didn't walk into a room. She occupied it, her heels clicking sharp and deliberate like punctuation marks, her perfume cutting through the air with a sweet, overpowering edge that made everything feel tighter, smaller. She carried a thick red folder tucked against her side like it was a weapon, flipping it open with exaggerated confidence as she spoke to her attorney, her voice just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, every word dripping with that familiar tone of someone who's used to getting their way. This whole thing started weeks earlier, a letter taped to our mailbox claiming violations that didn't make sense, escalating fines, warnings that felt less like rules and more like threats, and every time Emily responded calmly, professionally, it only seemed to make Vanessa push harder, like she needed a reaction to justify the pressure. By the time we got to court, Vanessa had built a narrative where we were the problem, where compliance meant submission and silence meant guilt, and she carried that story into the room like it was already decided. I could feel the tension building, not loud, not chaotic, but tight and controlled, like the moment before a storm. Breaks when the air gets heavy and every sound feels sharper. Vanessa stepped closer, closing the space between us, her eyes scanning Emily up and down with a quick, dismissive look, the kind that reduces a person to nothing in a second. And she started talking about rules, about authority, about how people like us needed to learn where we stood. And Emily didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened with that same quiet stillness that always made people underestimate her. I remember noticing the judge's chair again, still empty, the nameplate turned face down so no one could read it yet. And something about that detail stuck with me, like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite place. Vanessa leaned in closer, her voice dropping but still sharp, pushing boundaries that most people would have stepped back from, confident that this was her stage, her moment, her win already secured. And I stayed still, not because I didn't want to respond, but because I knew something she didn't, something that made every second feel like it was stretching out, building toward a point she couldn't see. The bailiff shifted near the wall, the faint creak of leather from his belt echoing in the quiet, and I caught that same glance again, quick, almost cautious, directed at Emily. Vanessa straightened up, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer like she'd just closed the final argument, her expression settling into that satisfied half-smile people wear when they think the outcome is already theirs. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the most important part of this entire room wasn't the documents in her hand or the words she'd just thrown into the air. It was that empty chair waiting at the front, the one thing she hadn't paid attention to, the one detail that was about to change everything in a matter of seconds. Vanessa did not step back after that first exchange, not even half an inch, and that told me everything I needed to know about how far she was willing to go. She believed pressure was power, that if she leaned in just a little more, spoke just a little louder, she could force the outcome she wanted, and in her world that had probably worked more times than it had failed. I could hear the faint rustle of papers as her attorney shifted beside her, uncertain but silent, while Vanessa flipped open her red folder again, tapping the top page with one manicured finger as if the document itself would intimidate us into compliance. She began listing violations, numbers, dates, sections of HOA code that sounded impressive but hollow, her voice carrying across the room with that polished sharpness that people use when they want to sound official without actually being questioned. Emily did not interrupt her, did not correct her, did not even glance down at the folder. And that stillness seemed to irritate Vanessa more than any argument could have. I noticed how Vanessa's smile tightened, how her tone shifted from confident to cutting, like she needed to provoke a reaction just to confirm she was still in control. "You people always think the rules do not apply to you," she said, loud enough for the clerk at the side desk to hear. And I felt the temperature in the room drop, not physically but socially. The kind of silence that spreads when a line has been crossed, but no one has decided yet who is going to acknowledge it. Emily finally looked at her then, not with anger, not with fear, just a steady, measured look that did not match the role Vanessa had already assigned to her. And for a brief second, something flickered in Vanessa's expression, like confusion trying to break through certainty, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came. I shifted slightly in my seat, feeling the edge of the wooden bench press into my leg, grounding myself, reminding myself to stay exactly where I was, because every instinct in me said to step in, to say something, to push back, but I knew that would ruin the timing, and timing was everything here. The bailiff moved again near the front, adjusting his stance, his hand briefly resting near the railing as he glanced toward the hallway entrance, and I followed that movement with my eyes, noticing the way the light from outside the courtroom cut across the floor in a narrow strip, like a line, separating what had already happened from what was about to happen. Vanessa continued, her words coming faster now, stacking accusations, exaggerations, painting a picture where she was the protector of order and we were the disruption, and I could see a couple of people in the back row exchange looks, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to suggest that not everyone was convinced by her performance. Still, Vanessa pressed on, because people like her do not stop when they sense doubt. They push harder, louder, faster, until doubt gets buried under volume. Emily adjusted her posture slightly, a small movement that most would miss, straightening her back, placing her hands on the edge of the table for just a moment before letting them rest again. And I recognized that shift, not as preparation to argue, but as alignment, like someone stepping into the exact position they needed to be in before something important begins. Vanessa noticed it too, but she misread it completely, her smile widening as if she had finally broken through, as if she had pushed Emily to the edge she had been aiming for. "That is right," she said, her voice dropping into something almost triumphant. "Now you are starting to understand how this works." And I almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of the sheer distance between what she believed was happening and what was actually unfolding. The clerk at the side desk cleared her throat softly, a small, polite sound that carried more weight than it should have, and Vanessa paused just long enough to be annoyed by it, glancing over with a quick, dismissive look before turning back to us. I looked once more at the judge's chair, still empty, still waiting, the dark cloth draped over it unmoved, the nameplate still turned away, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle in, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it already knows how this ends. Vanessa took a half step back then, adjusting her blazer, preparing to sit as if the next part of the process was already hers to command, and in that exact moment, the door at the side of the room opened just a few inches wider, letting in a sliver of brighter light, and everything shifted so slightly that if you were not paying attention, you would miss it entirely, but I was paying attention, and I knew we were seconds away from the moment she would realize she had been standing in the wrong position this entire time. The door did not swing open dramatically. It moved just a few inches more, slow and controlled, but that small shift pulled every ounce of attention in the room toward it like gravity had changed direction. The bailiff straightened immediately, his posture tightening in a way that signaled something official was about to begin, and the clerk at the side desk stopped typing mid-line, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if she already knew what came next. Vanessa did not notice any of it at first, still focused on her own momentum, still convinced she was driving this entire room forward, and she let out a short, confident breath like someone preparing to sit back and watch their plan unfold. I could hear the faint click of Emily's heel against the floor as she shifted her weight, a single, precise movement that felt louder than it should have in the growing quiet. And for the first time since we walked in, she looked away from Vanessa and toward the front of the room, toward that chair. "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the air, firm but not loud, and it changed everything instantly, like a switch had been flipped and the room had entered a different reality. Chairs scraped back in uneven rhythm, papers rustled, people stood, and Vanessa turned, just slightly at first, her expression still carrying that half-finished confidence, as if she expected to see someone else walk in, someone she could still control or influence. I stood up beside Emily, feeling the tension shift from waiting to execution, and I watched Vanessa's face carefully. Because this was the moment where belief collides with reality, and you can actually see it happen if you are paying attention. Emily stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a calm, steady walk that carried her past the table, past the railing, toward the front where that chair had been waiting the entire time. Vanessa's brows pulled together, confusion flickering across her features as she tried to process why the woman she had just been talking down to was moving in that direction. And I could almost see the calculations failing to line up in her head. The bailiff moved to the side, giving Emily space, his earlier glances now making complete sense, and the clerk reached forward to adjust the small nameplate on the desk, her movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. Emily reached the chair and paused for half a second, just long enough for the room to settle into complete silence, the kind of silence where even breathing feels like it might be too loud. And then she sat down. The sound of the chair settling was soft, controlled, but it carried through the room like a final note, and the clerk turned the nameplate outward with a simple motion that took less than a second but changed everything. Honorable Emily Carter. I saw it land on Vanessa's face the exact moment she read it. That instant where the mind refuses to accept what the eyes are seeing, where confidence drains away and gets replaced by something colder, heavier, something closer to realization. Her shoulders stiffened, her mouth parted slightly as if she was about to speak, but could not find the words fast enough, and the color in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to show that the ground beneath her had moved. The red folder in her hand lowered a few inches without her noticing. The pages inside no longer looking like weapons, but like weight she suddenly did not know how to carry. Emily looked out over the room, her expression unchanged from the moment we walked in, calm, measured, completely in control, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and carried a kind of authority that does not need to raise its volume to be heard. Please be seated, she said, and the room followed immediately, chairs moving in near unison this time. The earlier uncertainty replaced by a clear understanding of who was in charge. Vanessa sat down slower than everyone else, her movements no longer sharp or deliberate but careful, almost hesitant, like she was recalibrating every assumption she had walked in with. I remained standing for a second longer than necessary, just long enough to take in the full picture, the shift in posture, the shift in tone, the shift in power, and then I sat beside the table again, folding my hands the same way I had before, except now the room felt entirely different. Vanessa tried to recover. I could see it in the way she straightened her back, in the way she lifted her chin just a fraction, as if posture alone could restore what had just been lost. But the energy was gone, replaced by something tighter, more cautious, more aware. She had walked in believing she controlled the outcome, that this was just another step in enforcing her version of order. And now she was sitting across from the very authority she had ignored, challenged, and completely misread. And the most important part was not that Emily was the judge, it was that every word Vanessa had said, every move she had made, every assumption she had relied on, was now sitting in the same room with her, about to be examined under a standard she did not get to define anymore. Vanessa cleared her throat softly, the sound barely audible, but carrying the weight of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond her reach, and I could see her mind working in real time, searching for a version of events where this still made sense for her, where she could reposition herself, reframe what just happened, anything that would put her back on stable ground. She adjusted the edge of her red folder again, but this time the movement was slower, less certain, like she was suddenly aware that every small action might be noticed, evaluated, remembered. Emily remained still behind the bench, her hands resting lightly in front of her, posture straight, expression composed, not cold, not harsh, just precise, the kind of calm that does not react because it does not need to. "Counsel, you may proceed," she said, her voice even and controlled. and it landed in the room with a clarity that made everything else feel quieter by comparison. Vanessa's attorney stepped forward, hesitating just a fraction before beginning, his earlier confidence now replaced with careful wording, measured pacing, and I could hear it immediately. The difference between someone presenting a case they believed was strong and someone navigating around something they did not fully understand anymore. He referenced the HOA guidelines, the alleged violations, the notices sent, all the same points Vanessa had been pushing, but now they sounded different. Stripped of the force she had tried to give them, reduced to lines on paper that needed to stand on their own. Emily listened without interruption, her gaze steady, occasionally glancing down at the documents in front of her, turning a page with a quiet, deliberate motion that seemed to slow the entire rhythm of the room. Vanessa watched her closely, too closely, like she was trying to read something hidden between those small movements, searching for a sign, a weakness, a reaction she could use, but there was nothing there except focus, and that absence of reaction seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. When the attorney finished, there was a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of the presentation to settle, and then Emily spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, asking a question about the timeline of the notices, a detail that sounded simple on the surface but carried enough precision to shift the entire direction of the conversation. The attorney responded, flipping through his notes, clarifying dates, referencing correspondence, and I watched as Emily followed each answer with another question, each one narrowing the space, tightening the structure, turning what had seemed like a broad, confident claim into something that needed exact support. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her earlier stillness breaking, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the folder before stopping abruptly, as if she realized even that small sound might be too much. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, but focused, like everything had been pulled into alignment around a single point. I leaned back slightly, feeling the edge of the bench against my shoulders, and for the first time since we walked in, I allowed myself to breathe normally, because the outcome was no longer about what Vanessa said or how loudly she said it. It was about what could be shown, what could be verified, what could hold under the kind of scrutiny she had never expected to face. Emily asked about enforcement consistency, about how similar cases had been handled, about whether the same standards had been applied across all residents, and each question seemed to take a small piece of Vanessa's earlier confidence with it. The attorney answered as best he could, but there were gaps now, small ones at first, then more noticeable, places where assumptions had been made, where procedures had not been followed as precisely as claimed. Vanessa leaned forward, slightly, whispering something to him, her voice tight, controlled, but I could see the shift, the urgency that had replaced her earlier ease. The clerk typed steadily at the side, capturing every word, every answer, every pause, and that quiet tapping sound began to feel louder than anything Vanessa had said earlier, because now it represented permanence, a record that would not bend to volume or attitude. Emily turned another page, her expression unchanged, and then she looked up again, her gaze moving from the attorney to Vanessa for just a moment, not long, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge her presence in a way that felt entirely different from before. It was not the look of someone being challenged. It was the look of someone assessing, measuring, placing everything into its proper context. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, the full shift, not just in position but in reality itself, because Vanessa was no longer the person directing the narrative. She was part of it now, subject to the same rules she had tried to use against us, and there was no way for her to step outside of that anymore. The moment the questions became precise, the entire structure Vanessa had built started to sound thinner, like a wall that looked solid from a distance but revealed cracks the closer you stood to it. And I could see it in the way her attorney slowed down between answers, in the way he repeated phrases as if buying time would somehow strengthen them. Emily did not rush anything. She let every answer settle, let every word sit in the air just long enough to be fully understood before moving on. And that pacing changed everything because it forced clarity, it forced accuracy, it forced truth to stand on its own without decoration. She asked about the first notice again, not because she needed the answer, but because she wanted it stated clearly, on record, and when the attorney gave the date, She followed with another question about delivery confirmation, a small detail that most people would overlook, but one that immediately shifted the tone when he hesitated before answering. Vanessa leaned closer to him again, whispering faster this time. Her earlier composure now replaced with something tighter, something closer to urgency, and I could see her fingers press harder against the folder, the edge of the paper slightly bending under the pressure. The clerk's typing continued steadily, capturing every pause, every hesitation, and that sound had become a kind of rhythm in the room, marking the distance between confidence and reality. Emily turned another page, her movements controlled, unhurried, and then she asked about enforcement across other residents, requesting examples, dates, outcomes, and this time the answers came with less certainty, more qualifiers, more explanations that sounded like they were being built in real time instead of recalled. Vanessa shifted again, her posture no longer relaxed but forward, alert, as if she was trying to stay ahead of something she could not fully see. I watched her expression carefully, the way her eyes moved between Emily, her attorney, and the documents, searching for something to hold on to, something that still made her feel in control. But every new question seemed to take that away piece by piece. Emily did not raise her voice, did not change her tone, but there was a firmness there now, a quiet insistence on accuracy that made it impossible to hide behind general statements or assumptions. She asked about internal review procedures, about whether any independent verification had been conducted before issuing penalties, and when the answers came back incomplete, the gap was no longer subtle. It was visible, measurable, undeniable. Vanessa exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that sounded more like a reset than a release, and she sat back for a moment before leaning forward again, as if she could physically push herself back into control. But control in this room did not respond to posture or volume. It responded to detail, to consistency, to evidence, and that was a language she had not prepared to speak at this level. I felt a shift inside myself then, not relief exactly, but recognition. The understanding that this was no longer about defending ourselves. It was about watching the truth organize itself in a way that did not require force. Emily paused for a moment, looking down at the file in front of her, and the room followed that pause instinctively, everyone waiting, listening, as if even silence now carried meaning. When she looked up again, her gaze moved directly to Vanessa, not sharply, not accusingly, but with a clarity that made the distance between them feel smaller and more defined at the same time. "Ms. Cole," she said, her voice steady, "I would like to clarify your role in approving these actions." And the shift was immediate, because now it was no longer just about documents or procedures, it was about responsibility. Vanessa straightened slightly, drawing in a breath, preparing to speak, and for a brief second, I saw a flicker of her old confidence return, the instinct to take control, to assert, to dominate the narrative again. But this room was no longer responding to that version of her, and as she began to answer, carefully, deliberately, choosing each word with more caution than before, it became clear that she was no longer leading the conversation. She was following it, step by step, question by question, into a place where every assumption she had relied on would need to hold up under a level of scrutiny she had never expected to face. Vanessa's answer came out controlled at first, measured, like she was stepping onto thin ice and testing each word before placing her full weight on it. But there was something missing now, something that had been there when she first walked in, that unshaken certainty that her version of events would carry the room without resistance. "I oversee enforcement decisions," she said, her voice steady but quieter than before. And even that small shift in volume felt significant in a room where every sound had started to matter. Emily did not respond immediately. She let the statement settle, let it exist on its own for a moment before asking the next question, one that sounded simple but landed with precision, asking whether those enforcement decisions were based on verified inspections or on reports submitted without confirmation. The attorney shifted again, glancing at Vanessa before answering. And that glance alone told me more than the words that followed, because it showed where the authority actually sat and how uncertain it had become. "Reports are reviewed," he said, choosing language carefully, and Emily followed with another question, narrowing the focus. asking how often those reports were independently verified before penalties were issued. And this time the hesitation was longer, just a second, maybe less, but enough for everyone in the room to notice. The clerk's typing continued, steady and consistent, capturing that pause just as clearly as any spoken word, and I could feel the shift deepen, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, the earlier tapping gone, replaced with stillness that looked less like control and more like restraint. I leaned forward just a fraction, not enough to draw attention, just enough to stay present in the moment, because this was where the structure she had built either held or started to give way. Emily turned another page, the soft sound of paper moving, through her hands cutting cleanly through the quiet, and then she referenced a specific notice, the one dated 3 weeks prior, asking whether there had been any documented inspection before that notice was issued. The attorney flipped through his folder, searching, his movements quicker now, less composed, and when he answered, the words came with qualifiers, with explanations, with context that sounded like it was being assembled rather than recalled. Vanessa leaned closer to him again, whispering, her voice low and urgent, and I saw the difference. Clearly now, the shift from someone directing a situation to someone reacting to it. Emily listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when the answer finished, she asked one more question, this time about consistency, about whether other residents with similar reports had received the same level of enforcement or if the actions taken against us were unique. The room held still for that one, because it was no longer about procedure alone, it was about fairness, about pattern, about whether the system Vanessa claimed to represent actually applied equally. The attorney responded, but the answer lacked the clarity of the earlier ones, filled with general statements that did not quite meet the precision of the question, and I saw Vanessa's expression tighten again, that controlled composure slipping just enough to reveal the pressure underneath. Emily made a small note in front of her, the pen moving briefly across the page, and that simple act carried weight, because it signaled that what had just been said was not only heard but recorded, considered, placed into a larger framework that Vanessa could not see but was now part of. I felt a quiet realization settle in, the kind that does not arrive all at once but builds piece by piece, that this was no longer about defending ourselves against accusations. It was about watching those accusations be examined under a level of clarity that stripped them down to what they actually were. Vanessa straightened again, drawing in a breath as if preparing to reassert herself, and for a moment it looked like she might try to take control of the narrative again, to speak, to interrupt, to push back. But something stopped her, whether it was the setting, the presence of the bench, or the growing awareness that the rules here did not respond to force. Emily looked up once more, her gaze moving from the documents to Vanessa, and there was no change in her expression, no sign of personal reaction, only that same steady focus that had been there from the beginning. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm authority, but now there was something else beneath it, something firmer, something that made it clear that the next part of this was not about questions anymore. It was about conclusions that were starting to take shape in a way Vanessa could no longer control. The room did not feel tense anymore. It felt precise, like every piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be, and now all that remained was to see the full picture clearly. And I could sense that even Vanessa understood it on some level, because she stopped trying to push forward and instead began choosing her stillness carefully, as if movement itself might work against her. Emily glanced down at her notes one more time, not searching, not reconsidering, just confirming, and then she looked back up, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, the quiet authority in her presence now fully settled into the room. The court has reviewed the submitted documentation and the testimony presented, she said, her voice even, controlled, carrying across the space without effort, and every word seemed to land with weight because nothing in her tone was wasted. Vanessa straightened instinctively, her hands now resting flat against the table, her fingers no longer tapping, no longer fidgeting, as if she was bracing for something she could not fully anticipate. Emily continued, referencing specific points, the timeline inconsistencies, the lack of documented verification, the uneven application of enforcement, each detail laid out clearly, not as an argument, but as an established sequence of facts that no longer depended on interpretation. I watched Vanessa's expression carefully. The way her eyes followed each word. The way her jaw tightened slightly when certain details were mentioned. The way her earlier confidence had fully transformed into something quieter, something more contained, something that looked like realization settling in piece by piece. The clerk's typing slowed slightly, matching the cadence of Emily's words, capturing each point as it was spoken, turning them into record, into something permanent that would exist beyond this room. Emily paused briefly, just long enough for the structure of what she had said to fully settle, and then she addressed the core issue directly, her tone unchanged but the focus sharper now, stating that enforcement actions must be supported by consistent procedure and verified evidence, and that deviations from that standard raise concerns about fairness and validity. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, and for the first time since the hearing began, she did not try to interrupt, did not try to redirect, did not try to reclaim control. She simply listened. I felt the shift fully then, not just in the room, but in the story itself, because this was no longer about who spoke louder or who appeared more certain. It was about what held up when examined closely, and that standard had already done its work. Emily's gaze moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the presence of everyone there, the attorney, the clerk, the bailiff, the observers in the back, and then returned to Vanessa, not with confrontation, but with clarity. Based on the information presented, she said, the court finds that the enforcement actions in this case lack sufficient procedural support. And even though her tone remained calm, the impact of those words was immediate, visible in the way Vanessa's posture shifted again, her hands pressing slightly firmer against the table, her eyes dropping for a brief moment before lifting again as if to confirm what she had just heard. There was no dramatic reaction, no raised voices, no visible outburst, just a quiet, unmistakable understanding that the direction of this case had changed completely. Emily continued, outlining the next steps, the need for review, the expectation of consistent standards moving forward, each sentence measured, each word reinforcing the same principle that had guided everything from the moment she sat in that chair. I leaned back slightly, feeling the tension that had been sitting in my chest finally ease, not because of relief alone, but because of the clarity of it all, the way everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to once. It was placed under the right kind of light. Vanessa remained still, listening, absorbing, no longer trying to shape the outcome, but recognizing it as something already taking form. And in that moment, it became clear that the real shift had not happened when Emily sat down at the bench. It had happened when the standard of truth replaced the illusion of control, and there was nothing Vanessa could do to change that now. The words did not echo, they settled, and that difference mattered more than anything Vanessa had said earlier, because nothing Emily spoke needed repetition to carry weight. The room absorbed it, quiet and steady, and I could see the realization continue to unfold across Vanessa's face, not all at once, but in small, undeniable shifts, like someone slowly recognizing that the ground they trusted was never solid to begin with. Emily did not rush forward after that finding. She allowed the silence to hold. For a moment, just long enough for the meaning to anchor itself. And then she continued, outlining the implications with the same measured clarity, explaining that any enforcement lacking proper verification and consistent application could not stand as presented, that procedural integrity was not optional. It was the foundation. Vanessa blinked once, slowly, her gaze dropping to the red folder in front of her, as if the answers might still be there, as if she could find something within those pages that would restore what had already slipped away. But the folder remained just paper now, no longer a symbol of control, just a collection of claims that had not held up. Her attorney shifted beside her again, leaning in slightly, his voice low as he spoke to her, but there was no urgency in it now. No strategy being formed in real time, only the quiet tone of someone acknowledging the direction things had taken. Emily's pen moved once more across her notes, a brief, precise motion, and then she looked up again, her focus returning to Vanessa, not as an opponent, not as someone to confront, but as someone accountable within the process that had just been laid out. The court expects that any future enforcement actions follow established procedures with documented verification, she said, her tone unchanged. But the statement carried a forward weight, a clear expectation that extended beyond this moment. Beyond this case, Vanessa nodded slightly, almost automatically, the movement small but telling, because it was no longer the nod of agreement. It was the nod of recognition, of understanding that the structure she had relied on had been redefined in front of her. I noticed how still the rest of the room had become, how even the smallest sounds had faded, the earlier tension replaced by a kind of clarity that did not need volume to be felt. The bailiff remained near the front, posture relaxed but attentive. The clerk continued to finalize her notes, each keystroke deliberate, each one reinforcing that what had just happened was now part of an official record. Emily glanced once more at the file before her, confirming what had already been established, and then she spoke again, outlining the resolution, stating that the actions taken against us could not be enforced as presented, that further review would be required before any valid claim could proceed. The words were calm, controlled, but they carried finality, not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one, like a door closing quietly but completely. Vanessa exhaled again, slower this time, her shoulders lowering slightly as the last piece settled into place, and she did not argue, did not interrupt, did not attempt to reshape the outcome. She simply sat there, absorbing it. Her earlier confidence now fully replaced by a quiet, contained stillness. I felt something shift in me again, not just relief, but perspective, because this had never been about overpowering her, never about matching her intensity. It had always been about letting the truth stand where it could not be pushed aside. Emily's gaze moved across the room one final time, acknowledging the process, the people, the space itself, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the clerk, signaling completion. "This matter is concluded for today," she said, and with that, the structure that it held, everything in place began to release, not abruptly, but naturally, as people shifted in their seats, as papers were gathered, as the room returned to movement. Vanessa remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, her hands still resting on the table, her eyes fixed ahead, as if she was replaying everything that had just happened, searching for the point where it had changed, where it had slipped beyond her control. And the truth was, it had changed long before she realized it, in the quiet details she had ignored, in the assumptions she had made, in the belief that authority was something you could project instead of something you had to support. And now she was sitting in the middle of that realization with no way to step outside of it. People began to move again, slowly at first, chairs sliding back, quiet conversations starting in low voices that stayed close to the ground as if the room itself was still holding onto the weight of what had just happened. And I remained seated for a moment longer, watching Vanessa from across the table, because I wanted to see what came after the realization, what remained when the performance was gone. She finally gathered her folder, but the movement was different now, careful, deliberate, no sharp edges, no sense of control, just a task being completed because it had to be. Her attorney spoke to her again in a low voice, pointing at a page, explaining something, but she did not respond the way she had earlier. There was no quick nod, no confident interruption, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if she was listening in a different way now, not to respond, but to understand. Emily stood from the bench, the sound of the chair shifting behind her soft but final, and for a brief second the room seemed to align around her again, not because she demanded attention, but because it followed her naturally. She stepped down from the front, with the same calm pace she had carried the entire time. No change in expression, no visible reaction to the outcome. Just that steady presence that had never needed to prove itself. As she passed by, the bailiff gave a small nod, the clerk offered a brief glance of acknowledgement, and then Emily moved toward the side door without hesitation, without pause, as if this moment was simply one part of a much larger system that continued long after anyone left the room. I stood up then, smoothing the front of my jacket out of habit more than necessity, and turned back toward Vanessa, who was now standing as well, her posture upright but no longer rigid, her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested something had been released, something she had been holding on to without realizing it. For a second, our eyes met, and there was no hostility there, No lingering confrontation, just a quiet recognition of what had happened, of where things had shifted and where they now stood. She looked away. First, not sharply, not dismissively, just naturally, as if there was nothing left to hold on to in that exchange. I walked toward the exit, the sound of my steps measured against the floor, the earlier tension completely gone, replaced by a clarity that felt almost simple in comparison to everything that had built up to this moment. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, carrying the faint scent of coffee from somewhere down the hallway, mixed with the distant murmur of other cases, other lives moving through the same system. Emily was already there, standing near the window, the light from outside catching the edge of her profile, and for the first time since we walked in, she allowed herself a small breath that looked like release. Not from stress, but from completion. I stepped beside her, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Everything had already been placed exactly where it belonged. She glanced at me briefly, a subtle look that carried understanding more than words ever could, and then her attention shifted back to the hallway. Already moving forward, already focused on what came next. I looked back once more toward the courtroom door, now closed, quiet, holding everything that had just happened inside its walls, and I realized something that had been there from the beginning but only made sense now. Vanessa had believed power was something you could show, something you could push, something you could force into a room until everyone else adjusted around it. But what she encountered instead was something entirely different, something that did not need to raise its voice, did not need to announce itself, did not need to prove anything because it was already established, and that difference was what changed everything, not in a dramatic burst, not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet, precise steps that led to an outcome she could not control. I turned away from the door and followed Emily down the hallway, our footsteps steady, unhurried, and as we moved forward, the noise of the courthouse blending into the background. I understood that what happened in that room was not about winning or losing in the way Vanessa had framed it. It was about alignment, about truth meeting, structure at the exact point where it could no longer be ignored. And once that happened, everything else simply fell into place exactly as it was supposed to.